Two officers thought they were in for a good laugh when they decided to tail a black woman driving through an upscale neighborhood. It was a slow night, and they figured it wouldn't hurt to keep an eye out, though their real motivation was far from professional. They followed her car closely, exchanging smug remarks over the radio, certain they'd catch her doing something, anything, they could justify as suspicious. What they didn't know was that the woman wasn't just anyone. She had no idea they were following her either, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence that hinted at something much bigger. As the officers' casual surveillance turned into an unnecessary confrontation, they quickly realized they had made a huge mistake. Their target wasn't just an ordinary citizen. In fact, she had a connection so powerful that it would leave them scrambling to explain their actions. As the officers approached the woman's car, they wore smug expressions, certain they were in control. She was calm, composed, and clearly unimpressed by their presence. The older of the two officers leaned down to her window, asking for her license and registration, but his tone carried an edge of unnecessary authority. She handed over her documents without a word, her gaze steady, almost as if she was sizing them up. The younger officer scanned her license and froze for a moment, his brow furrowing. The name seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. Still, they pressed on, asking vague questions about why she was in the area and where she was headed. What they didn't notice was a small crowd forming a little further up the street. People were pulling out their phones, recording silently, and some even exchanged knowing glances. The officers had no idea they were digging themselves deeper. The woman remained quiet, watching as the officers whispered to each other, their confidence starting to waver. The younger officer looked at the license again, his lips moving silently as he read the name over and over. "Do you think she's?" he muttered, but the older officer brushed him off. "Doesn't matter who she is," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're doing our job." Meanwhile, the onlookers grew bolder, inching closer with their cameras still rolling. Some whispered to each other, while others simply stared at the scene unfolding before them. One man, standing near the edge of the crowd, dialed a number on his phone. "You won't believe this," he said, glancing back at the car. Inside the vehicle, the woman finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but carried an undeniable weight. "You're making a mistake," she said. The older officer chuckled nervously, but the younger one felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Something about her tone made it clear this wasn't just an idle warning. The younger officer's unease grew with every passing second. Something wasn't adding up, and the woman's calm demeanor only made him more nervous. He glanced at the crowd, now larger and buzzing with whispers. His partner, on the other hand, seemed determined to keep control, even as the situation began to slip through his fingers. "Step out of the vehicle," the older officer demanded. The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't move immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her eyes steady as they locked onto his. "Are you sure that's what you want to do?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. The officer stiffened, his authority challenged, but before he could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. "Do you even know who she is?" All eyes turned toward the man who had spoken, his phone raised as he gestured toward the car. The officers exchanged a quick, uneasy glance, their confidence faltering. The woman finally stepped out, standing tall and poised, as if she were addressing an audience rather than two officers. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. The older officer tried to regain control, but his words stumbled as the younger one leaned in and whispered urgently, "We've made a mistake, a big one." But it was too late. Sirens sounded in the distance, drawing closer with every second. The tension in the air reached its peak as the officers realized they were no longer in control, not of the scene, not of the narrative, and certainly not of the woman who now stood before them. The sirens grew louder, their wail cutting through the tense silence. The officers stood frozen, unsure whether to stay their course or back down. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she crossed her arms, her expression unreadable but far from intimidated. The older officer muttered something under his breath, his frustration mounting, while the younger one kept glancing nervously at the approaching vehicles. Moments later, two black SUVs with tinted windows pulled up, their presence commanding instant attention. Uniformed personnel stepped out, and one of them, a tall man in a sharp suit, walked straight toward the scene. He didn't hesitate, his focus locked on the woman. The older officer opened his mouth to speak, but the suited man raised a hand, silencing him without a word. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the woman with a respectful nod. "Are you all right?" The officer's confusion deepened. Who was this man, and why was he treating her with such deference? Before they could piece it together, the man turned to them, his expression cold and unyielding. "Do you have any idea who you stopped?" he asked, his voice cutting like a blade. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, while the older one stammered, trying to explain. But then the crowd erupted with murmurs as someone whispered the truth loud enough to be heard. "She's the governor's mother." The words spread like wildfire, and the weight of their mistake hit the officers like a ton of bricks. The woman didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. This was far from over. The older officer's face went pale as the weight of the revelation sank in. He fumbled for words, but none came out. The younger officer, his voice shaky, finally said, "We didn't know. We were just..." But the man in the suit cut him off sharply. "You were just what? Profiling? Harassing her for no reason?" His voice carried a controlled fury that made the crowd fall silent. The woman, still calm and composed, finally broke her silence. "Let them finish," she said, her tone measured but laced with authority. The older officer looked at her, his confidence completely shattered. "We didn't mean any harm," he stammered. "We didn't know who you were." She tilted her head, a faint, knowing smile crossing her lips. "And if I wasn't the governor's mother, what then?" Her words hung in the air, cutting through any excuses they might have had. The man in the suit stepped forward again, pointing toward the officers. "Your actions tonight have consequences. You will answer for this." Before they could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned to see another figure stepping out of one of the SUVs. It was the governor himself. The crowd gasped as he approached his mother, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle this personally," he said, his gaze fixed on the officers, who now looked like they wanted to sink into the ground. Just when it seemed the story had reached its peak, the governor's mother turned to her son and said, "Let them go." The crowd murmured in surprise, and even the officers looked stunned. "They've learned their lesson," she added, her eyes locking with theirs. "But make sure they never forget it." As the officers stumbled back to their car, the woman stepped into her SUV without another word. The governor gave them one final look, his expression unreadable, before following her. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving the officers alone in the aftermath of their own actions, their careers, and reputations, hanging by a thread. As the SUVs disappeared into the night, the two officers sat silently in their patrol car, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. The older officer stared at the steering wheel, his hands trembling slightly, while the younger one gazed out the window, replaying the night's events in his mind. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. They both knew this incident would follow them, reshaping their lives and careers in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Word of the encounter spread quickly, and by the next morning, the story was all over the news. The woman's grace and restraint became the focus of conversations across the city, sparking discussions about respect, accountability, and the power of composure in the face of injustice. For the officers, it was a sobering reminder of the consequences of their choices. For everyone else, it was proof that even the smallest actions can reveal a person's true character.